In the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, there lived a woman named Maya. She was 32 years old, full of kindness, and had a smile that could light up even the darkest room. Maya worked as a nanny, taking care of kids while their parents were busy with work or life. Her days were long, but she loved what she did because every child she met taught her something new. This time, however, her next job would change her life in ways she never imagined. Maya got hired by a wealthy family, the Carters. They weren't your typical rich people who threw fancy parties or showed off their money. Instead, they lived quietly in a huge mansion on the outskirts of the city. The father, James, was a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune through technology. He wasn't flashy, but he carried himself with confidence. However, behind his success hid a deep sadness. His wife, Ethan's mom, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise their young son alone. Ethan was 6 years old, and he hadn't spoken a single word since his mother died. Doctors called it selective mutism, saying it was likely due to trauma. But no matter how many specialists visited the house or therapies were tried, Ethan remained silent. To most people, he seemed like a ghost, quiet, distant, and unreachable. Yet beneath those big, curious eyes lay a world waiting to be understood. When Maya first walked into the Carter mansion, she felt both nervous and excited. The house was beautiful, filled with expensive furniture and artwork, but it lacked warmth. It felt more like a museum than a home. As she sat down with James to discuss her role, she couldn't help but notice the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He looked tired, not just physically but emotionally. When he talked about Ethan, his voice cracked slightly, revealing a father desperate to reconnect with his son. "Ethan doesn't talk," James explained, running a hand through his hair. "He hasn't said a word in 3 years. I've tried. Everything, therapists, counselors, you name it, but nothing works. I need someone patient, someone who can reach him where others haven't." Maya nodded, feeling a mix of determination and compassion. She didn't promise miracles because she knew better than to make empty guarantees, but she assured James that she'd do her best. Little did she know, this decision would lead to moments she'd remember forever. On her first day, Maya met Ethan. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor of his playroom, surrounded by toys he barely touched. At first glance, he seemed uninterested in anything around him. But Maya noticed something different. He watched her carefully, studying her every move. There was intelligence in his gaze, a spark that hinted at the boy hidden inside. Instead of bombarding him with questions or trying to force interaction, Maya decided to take things slow. She brought out some paints and paper, setting them up on a small table nearby. Without saying much, she started painting shapes and patterns, humming softly to herself. After a while, Ethan crawled over cautiously, peeking at what she was doing. Maya smiled warmly and handed him a brush. "You can try if you want," she said gently, keeping her tone light and inviting. Ethan hesitated for a moment before dipping the brush into the paint. Slowly, he began adding strokes to the page, mimicking some of the designs Maya had made. Though he didn't speak, his actions spoke volumes. For the first time in months, or maybe even years, someone had managed to engage him without pressure. Over the following weeks, Maya spent hours each day with Ethan. She introduced him to African folktales, telling stories of brave heroes and wise ancestors. These tales weren't just entertaining. They carried lessons about strength, resilience, and hope. Ethan listened intently, his wide eyes following Maya's animated expressions. Sometimes he'd point to pictures in the books or clap his hands when something surprised him. Each tiny reaction was like a victory, proof that progress was possible. One afternoon, Maya brought out a box of clay. Together, they molded animals and objects, laughing whenever a giraffe turned out looking more like a blob. During these playful sessions, Maya avoided pushing Ethan to communicate verbally. Instead, she focused on building trust and creating a safe space where he could express himself freely. And slowly, Ethan began opening up, not with words, but with gestures, facial expressions, and occasional giggles. Despite the growing bond between Maya and Ethan, tension brewed elsewhere in the household. James appreciated Maya's efforts, but he struggled to understand why Ethan responded so well to her. Why did his own son seem more comfortable with a stranger than with his own father? Frustration bubbled beneath the surface, leading to awkward conversations and sometimes heated arguments. "I don't get it," James admitted one evening after putting Ethan to bed. "You've been here for 2 months, and already he's smiling. Playing, he hasn't done any of that with me." Maya sighed, choosing her words carefully. "It's not about me being special, Mr. Carter. Kids sense when someone is truly present with them. I'm not saying you're not trying, you are, but maybe you're too close to the situation. Sometimes stepping back and letting them find their own way helps." James frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. Still, he nodded reluctantly, knowing deep down that Maya might be right. Despite their differences, they shared a common goal, helping Ethan heal. As winter approached, Maya continued finding creative ways to connect with Ethan. She baked cookies with him, taught him simple sign language, and even let him help with household chores. Every little step forward filled her with pride, but she also knew there was still a long road ahead. What neither of them realized, though, was that a breakthrough was just around the corner, a moment that would change everything. Through patience, love, and unwavering dedication, Maya was breaking down walls that had stood strong for years. Ethan's silence wasn't permanent, it was simply a shield protecting him from pain, and Maya was determined to show him that it was okay to let go. As weeks turned into months, Maya began noticing small but significant changes in Ethan's behavior. At first, they were subtle things only someone who spent hours observing him would catch. For instance, he started following her around the house more often, not out of curiosity, but almost as if he wanted to stay close. One morning, while Maya was making breakfast in the kitchen, she noticed Ethan standing quietly by the doorway, watching her crack eggs into a bowl. His eyes were wide and his little hands gripped the doorframe tightly, as though he wasn't sure whether to step inside or retreat. "Hey there," Maya said softly, smiling at him over her shoulder. "Do you want to come in?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding slightly. He took a few cautious steps forward until he was standing right beside her. Maya handed him a wooden spoon and gestured toward the mixing bowl. "Here, why don't you help me stir this? But be careful, it's heavy." Ethan looked at the spoon, then back at Maya, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached out and grabbed it, wrapping his small fingers around the handle. With gentle guidance from Maya, he began stirring the mixture, his movements clumsy but determined. As they worked together, Maya couldn't help but notice how focused he was, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was one of those rare moments when she felt like she was truly connecting with him, not just as a caregiver, but as someone who mattered to him. These interactions became more frequent as time went on. Maya made it a point to include Ethan in everyday activities, no matter how mundane they seemed. Whether it was folding laundry, watering plants, or organizing his toys, she always found a way to involve him. Each task was an opportunity to build trust and create a sense of normalcy in his life. Over time, Ethan grew more comfortable around her, even initiating contact now and then. Sometimes he'd tap her arm to get her attention or tug at her sleeve when he wanted something. These tiny gestures might have gone unnoticed by others, but to Maya, they were monumental milestones. One rainy afternoon, Maya decided to spend some quality time indoors with Ethan. The weather outside was gloomy, with dark clouds looming overhead and rain tapping against the windows. To brighten the mood, she pulled out a box of colored pencils and a stack of blank paper. Sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, she began sketching simple shapes: a sun, a tree, a bird. Ethan watched intently from across the room, his head tilted slightly as if trying to figure out what she was doing. "Want to try?" Maya asked, holding up a pencil and offering him a piece of paper. Ethan didn't respond immediately, but after a few seconds he shuffled closer and accepted the supplies. At first, he drew random lines and scribbles, unsure of where to start. But as Maya continued drawing alongside him, he gradually mimicked her techniques, attempting to replicate the images she created. By the end of the session, they had a collection of colorful drawings scattered between them, each one telling its own little story. It was during this activity that something remarkable happened. Ethan suddenly stopped drawing and pointed to a picture Maya had sketched earlier, a woman holding a child's hand. His finger hovered over the image for a moment before he looked up at Maya expectantly. She froze, caught off guard by the clarity in his gaze. It was the first time he'd actively tried to communicate without being prompted. "You like this one?" Maya asked, picking up the drawing and showing it to him. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes locked onto hers. There was a flicker of emotion in his expression, something between longing and recognition. In that instant, Maya realized that Ethan understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. He wasn't just observing. He was processing, feeling, and remembering. Encouraged by this breakthrough, Maya decided to take things a step further. She introduced Ethan to sign language, hoping it would provide him with another means of communication. Starting with basic signs like yes, no, thank you, and more. She patiently demonstrated each gesture, repeating them until Ethan could mimic them accurately. To her delight, he picked up the signs quickly, using them to express his needs and preferences. When he wanted more juice, he signed more. When he didn't like a particular food, he shook his head and signed no. These small victories filled Maya with hope, reinforcing her belief that Ethan's silence wasn't permanent. It was simply a barrier waiting to be broken. While Maya celebrated these achievements, tension simmered beneath the surface of the household. James, despite his gratitude for Maya's efforts, struggled to reconcile his feelings about her growing influence over Ethan. On one hand, he was thrilled to see his son making progress. For the first time in years, Ethan seemed happy, engaged, and willing to interact with the world around him. But on the other hand, James couldn't shake the nagging thought that Maya was becoming too important to Ethan. Was she replacing his late wife in Ethan's mind? Or worse, was she filling a role that should have belonged to him? Their relationship became increasingly strained as these thoughts consumed James. He found himself questioning Maya's methods, even though they clearly worked. During one particularly heated argument, he confronted her about her approach. "Why does he listen to you and not me?" James demanded, his voice tinged with frustration. "I'm his father. I should be the one he turns to, not some stranger." Maya took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Carter, I'm not trying to replace you or your wife. I'm just here to help Ethan find his voice again. Kids need consistency, patience, and love. You're doing your best, and I know you care deeply about him. But sometimes it takes someone outside the situation to break through." James fell silent, his jaw clenched tightly. Though he hated to admit it, Maya's words struck a chord. Deep down, he knew she was right. Still, the jealousy and insecurity gnawed at him, making it difficult to fully embrace the changes happening in their home. Despite these challenges, Maya remained committed to helping Ethan. She refused to let James's doubts deter her from her mission. If anything, his resistance only fueled her determination to prove that Ethan's healing was possible. Every smile, every sign, and every shared moment reinforced her belief that she was exactly where she needed to be as winter approached. Maya continued finding new ways to connect with Ethan. She introduced him to music, playing soft melodies on a keyboard she borrowed from the attic. Together, they tapped rhythms on pots and pans, creating makeshift drums that echoed through the house. One evening, as they sat side by side on the couch, Maya sang a lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her, a soothing tune filled with warmth and nostalgia. Ethan listened quietly, his head resting against her arm. For the first time, Maya felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let go of his silence. Through patience, creativity, and unwavering dedication, Maya was breaking down walls that had stood strong for years. Ethan's muteness wasn't a prison, it was a shield protecting him from pain. And Maya was determined to show him that it was okay to lower it, one step at a time. One chilly evening, the sky outside was painted in shades of gray, heavy with rain clouds. The kind of night where the world felt quieter, as if it were holding its breath. Inside the Carter mansion, everything seemed calm, too calm almost. Maya had tucked Ethan into bed earlier than usual because he'd been unusually tired all day. She thought he might have caught a cold, given the sudden drop in temperature. As she sat in the living room reading a book, the sound of distant thunder rolled through the air, low and rumbling. Not long after, Maya heard faint crying coming from upstairs. It wasn't loud or frantic, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. She rushed to Ethan's room, pushing open the door gently. There he was, sitting up in his bed, tears streaming down his face, clutching a framed photograph tightly to his chest. The glow of his bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the room, highlighting the fear in his wide eyes. Maya hurried over and sat beside him on the edge of the bed. "Hey, sweetie," she whispered, brushing his hair back soothingly. "What's wrong?" Ethan didn't answer. He rarely did, but he leaned into her touch, letting her wrap an arm around him. That's when Maya noticed what he was holding, a picture of his late mother. Smiling brightly, her arms wrapped around a younger Ethan. Her heart sank. This wasn't just sadness. It was grief, raw and unspoken, bubbling to the surface after years of being buried deep inside. "It's okay," Maya murmured, pulling him closer. "You miss her, don't you?" Ethan nodded, his little body trembling against hers. The storm outside grew louder, flashes of lightning illuminating the room briefly. Maya knew this moment was bigger than just comforting a scared child. It was about helping him confront emotions he'd kept locked away for far too long. She began humming softly, a tune that had always calmed her during tough times. It was a lullaby her grandmother used to sing, a melody filled with warmth and reassurance. At first, Ethan stayed silent, his sobs growing softer as he listened. But then something incredible happened. In the middle of the song, Ethan opened his mouth and let out a faint hum along with the melody. Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. Had she imagined it? No, the sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a word, not yet, but it was unmistakably a sound. A real human sound. Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she pulled Ethan into a tight hug, rocking him gently. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "That was beautiful." For a moment, Ethan looked confused, as though he didn't fully understand what had just happened. But then, slowly, a tiny smile spread across his face, one so small it could have been missed if Maya hadn't been looking directly at him. It was progress, undeniable and precious. The next morning, Maya debated whether to tell James about what had happened. Part of her wanted to share the joy of the breakthrough immediately, but another part hesitated. She knew how complicated their dynamic was, and she worried about how James might react. Would he see it as a victory, or would he feel even more excluded from his son's journey? Deciding it was best to wait until the right moment, Maya kept the news to herself for now. Instead, she focused on building on the momentum from the previous night. Over breakfast, she encouraged Ethan to try making sounds again, starting with simple things like humming or blowing bubbles through a straw. He seemed hesitant at first, but with Maya's encouragement, he gave it another shot. Each attempt brought them closer to breaking through the invisible wall that had kept him silent for so long. Later that day, Maya decided to take Ethan outside for some fresh air. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a crisp, clean scent in the atmosphere. They wandered through the garden, picking up fallen leaves and tossing them into puddles. For a while, it felt like any other playful afternoon. But then, as they stood under a tree watching droplets fall from the branches, Ethan suddenly pointed upward and made a soft noise, a mix between a gasp and a laugh. Maya turned to him, grinning. "Did you hear that? You're doing amazing." Ethan's cheeks flushed pink, and he quickly looked away, embarrassed. But Maya could see the pride in his eyes. He was beginning to realize that his voice mattered, that it could express joy, surprise, and connection. And every time he made a sound, no matter how small, Maya celebrated it like it was the greatest achievement in the world. By the end of the week, Ethan was experimenting more frequently. He'd hum along to songs Maya played on the keyboard, mimic animal noises during story time, and even grunt playfully when tickled. These moments might have seemed insignificant to an outsider, but to Maya, they were proof that Ethan was finding his way back to the world. Eventually, the day came when Maya couldn't keep the secret anymore. One evening, as James walked into the living room, he found Ethan sitting on the floor with Maya, playing with a set of musical instruments. Maya was showing him how to tap out rhythms on a drum, and Ethan was giggling uncontrollably, clearly enjoying himself. When James approached, Ethan stopped laughing and looked up at his dad shyly. "Hey, buddy," James said, crouching down to Ethan's level. "What are you guys up to?" Before Maya could respond, Ethan surprised everyone, including himself, by letting out a high-pitched squeal and pointing excitedly at the drum. James blinked, stunned. He glanced at Maya, who was beaming proudly. "He's been practicing," she explained, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He's trying new sounds every day. Last night he hummed along to a song I sang. It's a big step." James stared at his son, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Maya worried that he might retreat into frustration or jealousy again, but instead he reached out and ruffled Ethan's hair affectionately. "That's my boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Then, turning to Maya, he added, "Thank you. I don't know how you did it, but thank you." It was a turning point not just for Ethan, but for James too. Seeing his son rediscover his voice reminded him of why he'd hired Maya in the first place. She wasn't there to replace anyone. She was there to help rebuild what had been broken. And for the first time, James allowed himself to feel hopeful about the future. As the days went on, Ethan continued to explore his newfound ability to make sounds. Sometimes he'd wake up early and sit by the window, mimicking the chirping of birds outside. Other times he'd join Maya in the kitchen, tapping spoons against pots to create impromptu symphonies. Each sound was a reminder that he was healing. Piece by piece, through it all, Maya remained patient and supportive, guiding Ethan without pushing him too hard. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be setbacks and challenges, but she also knew that Ethan was stronger than anyone realized. With each passing day, he was proving that silence wasn't forever. It was just a chapter in his story, one that was finally coming to an end. The days following Ethan's first sounds were filled with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Maya could feel the energy shifting in the house. It was lighter, freer, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for years and were finally exhaling. Every morning, she woke up eager to see what new progress Ethan might make. And every evening she went to bed feeling grateful for the small victories they'd shared throughout the day. James, too, seemed different. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was actively trying to connect with his son. Whether it was reading bedtime stories or attempting to play catch in the backyard, James was putting in real, heartfelt effort to be present in Ethan's life. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when frustration bubbled over, but Maya noticed that he was learning to let go of his insecurities. Slowly, he was starting to trust her, not just as a caregiver, but as someone who genuinely cared about Ethan's well-being. One sunny Saturday, Maya decided to take Ethan on a special outing. She'd been planning it for weeks, wanting to give him an experience outside the confines of the mansion. The Carters lived in a gated community surrounded by manicured lawns and pristine streets, but beyond that lay a world full of possibilities. Maya wanted Ethan to explore it, to feel like a normal kid instead of a boy trapped inside a silent bubble. They drove to a nearby park, one Maya had visited often during her own childhood. It was bustling with activity, families picnicking on blankets, dogs chasing frisbees, and kids running around with ice cream cones melting down their hands. As they stepped out of the car, Ethan looked around wide-eyed, taking in the sights and sounds. His grip on Maya's hand tightened slightly, unsure yet curious. "Ready to have some fun?" Maya asked, crouching down to meet his gaze. Ethan nodded hesitantly, his lips curling into a shy smile. They started with something simple, a game of tag. Maya ran ahead, laughing loudly to encourage Ethan to chase her. At first, he stayed rooted to the spot, watching her dash back and forth. But then, slowly, he began moving, his little legs pumping as he tried to catch up. When he finally tagged her, Maya pretended to collapse dramatically onto the grass, giggling uncontrollably. Ethan stood over her, his chest heaving from exertion, and let out a giggle of his own. It was infectious, spreading between them like wildfire. Next, they headed to the duck pond at the center of the park. Maya handed Ethan a bag of breadcrumbs and showed him how to toss them gently into the water. The ducks waddled closer, quacking eagerly, and Ethan clapped his hands in delight. For a while, they sat side by side, feeding the birds and soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. Maya pointed out different animals, a squirrel climbing a tree, a butterfly fluttering past, and Ethan followed her finger, fascinated by everything around him, but the highlight of the day came unexpectedly. As they walked along a paved path lined with trees, Ethan suddenly tripped over a root sticking out of the ground. He landed hard on his knees, scraping them against the rough pavement. Instantly, tears sprang to his eyes, and he cried out in pain. Maya rushed to his side, kneeling beside him. "Oh, no, sweetie," she said softly, inspecting the scrape. "Let me see." Ethan whimpered, clutching her arm tightly. Maya pulled out a tissue from her pocket and dabbed at the wound, cleaning away the dirt. "It's okay," she reassured him. "You're brave, remember? Just a little owie." As she spoke, Ethan buried his face in her shoulder, seeking comfort. Maya held him close, rubbing his back soothingly. Then, almost instinctively, she began singing the same lullaby she'd sung the night of the storm, the one that had coaxed his first hum. Her voice was soft and steady, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. That's when it happened. In a voice barely above a whisper, Ethan uttered his very first word, "Mommy?" Time seemed to freeze. Maya stopped singing mid-note, her heart pounding in her chest. Had she heard him correctly? She pulled back slightly, looking into his tear-streaked face. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan blinked, as if realizing what he'd just done. Then, louder this time, he repeated it. "Mommy!" Tears spilled down Maya's cheeks as she hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. It wasn't just any word, it was a word loaded with meaning, trust, and love. Though she knew Ethan wasn't calling her his biological mother, the title carried immense significance. To him, it represented safety, care, and belonging. And for Maya, it was validation that all her efforts had been worth it when they returned. Home later that afternoon, Maya debated whether to tell James about what had happened. Part of her wanted to share the milestone immediately, but another part worried about how he might react. Would he feel hurt that Ethan had called someone else mommy? Or would he see it as a sign of progress? Before she could decide, Ethan beat her to it. As soon as James walked into the living room, Ethan ran up to him, tugging at his sleeve. "Mommy, help me," he said clearly, pointing toward Maya. James froze, his eyes widening in shock. He glanced at Maya, then back at Ethan, his expression unreadable. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then slowly a smile spread across James's face, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "That's wonderful," he said, crouching down to Ethan's level. "I'm so proud of you, buddy." Maya exhaled a sigh of relief, realizing that James wasn't jealous or upset. Instead, he seemed genuinely happy for Ethan's breakthrough. It was a turning point for both of them. James understood now that Maya wasn't trying to replace Ethan's mother. She was helping him heal. And Ethan, in turn, was beginning to open up to the world again. Over the next few weeks, Ethan continued speaking more frequently. Words came haltingly, at first simple. Phrases like, "thank you," and "help me," but soon he was stringing together sentences. One evening, during dinner, he surprised everyone by asking, "Can we go to the park tomorrow?" James nearly dropped his fork. "Of course," he replied, his voice choked with emotion. "We can do whatever you want." Maya watched the exchange, with a lump in her throat. She knew these moments were priceless, not just for Ethan, but for James too. They were rebuilding their relationship, brick by brick, creating a foundation built on love and understanding. Still, Maya couldn't help but wonder where she fit into this new dynamic. She'd grown incredibly attached to Ethan, seeing him as the child she never had. But she also knew her role wasn't meant to last forever. Eventually, Ethan wouldn't need her as much. The thought filled her with bittersweet emotions, but she reminded herself that her purpose had always been to help, not to stay. One evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he looked up at her and sighed, "Love you, Mommy." Maya smiled, brushing his hair back tenderly. "I love you too, sweetheart, always." As she turned off the light and closed the door behind her, She felt a sense of fulfillment wash over her. She hadn't just helped Ethan find his voice, she'd given him permission to dream, to hope, and to live fully. And in doing so, she'd found a piece of herself she didn't know was missing. Outside, the stars twinkled brightly in the night sky, casting a gentle glow over the mansion. Inside, the Carters were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. Together, they were writing a new chapter, one filled with laughter, love, and endless possibilities. As weeks turned into months, the Carter household transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The once cold and distant mansion now buzzed with warmth and life. Ethan's laughter echoed through the halls, his voice growing stronger with each passing day. He wasn't just speaking, he was thriving. Every word he said felt like a victory, not just for him but for everyone who had supported him along the way. James, too, had changed. He was no longer the distant, frustrated father who struggled to connect with his son. Instead, he became actively involved in Ethan's daily life. Whether it was reading bedtime stories, helping him build puzzles, or teaching him how to ride a bike, James made sure to be present. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when self-doubt crept in. But Maya noticed that he was learning to let go of his fears. Slowly but surely, he was rebuilding the bond he'd thought was lost forever. Maya continued to play a vital role in their lives, though her position began to shift. She wasn't just a nanny anymore. She was more like a co-parent, someone both James and Ethan relied on. Her presence brought balance to the household, bridging the gap between father and son. Yet, as much as she loved being part of their family, Maya couldn't ignore the questions swirling in her mind. Where did she belong in this evolving dynamic? How long would she stay? And what would happen when Ethan no longer needed her? One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Maya sat down with James in the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. "I've been thinking," James finally said, breaking the quiet. "You've done so much for us, for Ethan, I don't know how to thank you." Maya smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't need to thank me. Seeing Ethan happy is enough." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Still, I want you to know how much you mean to us." "To me," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "When my wife passed away, I didn't think I could raise Ethan alone. I tried, but I failed. Then you came into our lives, and everything changed. You didn't just help Ethan find his voice, you helped me become a better father." Maya felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected such heartfelt gratitude, especially from someone who had once doubted her intentions. "I only did what anyone else would have done," she replied softly. "Ethan is an amazing kid. All he needed was love and patience." "That's true," James agreed, smiling slightly. "But it took someone special to give him that, someone like you." The conversation lingered in the air, filling the room with a sense of understanding and mutual respect. James went on to offer Maya a permanent position within the household, not just as a nanny, but as a co-parent figure. It was a bold move, one that acknowledged the undeniable impact she'd had on their family. Maya hesitated at first, unsure if accepting such a role was the right decision, but deep down, she knew she wanted to stay. This wasn't just a job, it was her home now. With Maya's new role came changes in their routine. Together, she and James worked as a team, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other. They established a rhythm that benefited everyone, especially Ethan. On weekends, they took turns planning activities. James introduced Ethan to sports, while Maya encouraged his creativity through art and music. Weeknights were reserved for family dinners where they laughed, shared stories, and sometimes even played games together. The Carters weren't just surviving, they were building a new kind of family, one rooted in love and trust. Years passed, and Ethan grew into a bright, confident boy. He never forgot the two women he called Mommy, his biological mother, whose memory he cherished, and Maya, who had taught him how to live again. Though he missed his mom deeply, he found comfort knowing that she was always with him in spirit. And Maya? She remained a constant presence in his life, guiding him through challenges and celebrating his achievements. Looking back, Maya realized that her journey with the Carters had been about more than just helping Ethan heal. It had been about finding purpose, a reason to wake up every morning and pour her heart into something greater than herself. Through Ethan, she discovered the joy of unconditional love, the kind that doesn't demand perfection but simply asks for presence. For James, the transformation was equally profound. He learned that being a parent wasn't about having all the answers. It was about showing up even when you felt lost. With Maya's support, he embraced his role as a father, flaws and all. Together, they created a partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals, proving that families aren't defined by blood but by the connections we nurture. On Ethan's 10th birthday, the three of them stood together in the backyard, watching fireworks light up the night sky. Ethan grinned ear to ear, pointing excitedly at the colorful explosions above. Beside him, James wrapped an arm around Maya's shoulders, pulling her close. In that moment, they weren't just a wealthy businessman, a dedicated caregiver, and a once silent child. They were a family bound by love, resilience, and hope. As the final firework faded into darkness, Maya glanced at Ethan, then at James. She felt a surge of gratitude, not just for the life she'd built with them, but for the reminder that healing is possible even after unimaginable loss. They had started as strangers brought together by circumstance, but they had grown into something extraordinary, a testament to the power of compassion, patience, and unwavering belief in second chances. And so their story continued, not as a tale of brokenness, but as one of redemption. A story about a boy who found his voice, a father who rediscovered his strength, and a woman who gave her whole heart to a family that needed her. Together, they proved that love has no limits, and that sometimes the most unexpected connections can lead to the deepest bonds of all.